The courtroom was silent. Thomas Kane sat in the witness box, his hands trembling, not from fear but rage. Across the room, seated at the plaintiff's table, were his sons. His sons. Matthew and Daniel Kane, the boys he had raised, fed, taught how to throw a baseball, taught how to shave, taught how to be men, were smiling. Smiling, as their lawyer argued that Thomas was mentally unfit to run the very company he had built from the ground up. And when the judge banged the gavel, ruling in their favor, Thomas heard the sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. They had taken everything. His company. His board seat. His life's work. And as he stood up, shoulders square despite his age, Thomas Kane swore one thing under his breath, so quiet only he could hear it. The air inside the courtroom was cold, almost cruelly so. Thomas Kane sat on the wooden bench, his palms flat on his knees, feeling every grain of the polished wood against his calloused skin. He was 71 years old, but his frame was still tall, broad-shouldered. A man who had built an empire with his own hands. Kane Industries wasn't just a company, it was his life's work. From a single workshop fixing farm equipment to a nationwide manufacturing giant, Thomas had poured 40 years of sweat and blood into it. And now he was about to lose it all. His eyes drifted across the room. There they were, Matthew and Daniel, his two sons. His flesh and blood. Matthew sat stiff, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, expression cold and unreadable. At 36, he looked like a younger version of Thomas, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, but colder, harder, as if the warmth had been cut out of him. Daniel, 3 years younger, shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing under the table. He was always the softer of the two, more emotional, but right now he refused to meet Thomas's gaze. Their lawyer stood, a polished man with expensive shoes and a rehearsed expression of sympathy. "Your Honor," he began, "it is with great difficulty that my clients, the sons of Mr. Thomas Kane, bring this petition before the court. But Mr. Kane's recent erratic behavior, questionable financial decisions, and refusal to step down from his leadership role have endangered not only the company, but the employees who depend on it." Thomas's lawyer, a young associate from a mid-tier firm, stood to object, but the judge silenced him with a wave. The words blurred together after that. Medical evaluations, board testimony, fabricated reports about Thomas forgetting meetings, signing incorrect contracts. He wanted to shout, to tell them they were lying, that he was perfectly fine. But when his sons took the stand, the knife twisted. "Dad has been struggling," Matthew said in a calm, measured voice. "We tried talking to him. We begged him to take a step back. He refuses. We can't watch him destroy everything he built." Thomas stared at him, stunned. Destroy everything? He had kept the company profitable through a recession. He had saved hundreds of jobs when other companies were laying off workers. Then Daniel spoke, his voice quieter but still cutting. "Dad forgets things. He called me by Matt's name 3 times last week. He missed the quarterly review meeting. We're worried about him." That was it. That was their argument. His sons had painted him as senile. When the judge finally spoke, her words landed like hammer blows. "Based on the evidence presented, I am ruling in favor of the petitioners. Effective immediately, Mr. Thomas Kane is removed from his position as CEO of Kane Industries and declared mentally unfit to manage corporate assets. Control of the company will pass to the board, with Matthew Kane as interim CEO." The gavel hit the block. Silence. Thomas rose slowly, every muscle in his body tense, his jaw locked. He looked directly at Matthew. "You've been waiting for this day, haven't you?" His voice was low, dangerous. Matthew didn't flinch. "This is for your own good, Dad. Step aside before you destroy yourself." Thomas turned to Daniel, searching his face for some hint of remorse, but Daniel wouldn't look at him. And in that moment, Thomas Kane knew one thing with absolute clarity. He wasn't losing to outsiders. He wasn't losing to time. He was losing to his own blood. He walked out of the courtroom without another word, but inside, a fire had started. The house was too quiet. Thomas sat in his study, the shelves lined with photos, Matthew in his college graduation gown, Daniel holding his first trophy at a science fair, family Christmases from years past. He stared at them one by one, his chest tight. His sons had not just taken his company. They had humiliated him in front of the entire board, the press, the town. The phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Board vote was unanimous. Don't fight this, Dad. We'll handle things from here. Enjoy retirement. Thomas gripped the phone until his knuckles turned white. Retirement. He had given them everything. The company, the connections, the future. And this was how they repaid him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring at the amber liquid as the clock ticked on the wall. And then, slowly, a strange calm washed over him. If they thought this was the end, they were wrong. They had taken his crown. Now he would take their kingdom. Thomas stood, picked up a pen, and began writing a list of names. Former allies. Old friends. People who still owed him favors. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Thomas Kane, father, builder, betrayed man, began planning the most patient, most devastating revenge of his life. And he would make sure his sons watched as everything they stole turned to ashes in their hands. The next morning, Thomas Kane woke to the sound of his name on the television. Former CEO Thomas Kane was officially removed from his position yesterday after a court ruled him mentally unfit to manage Kane Industries, the news anchor said, her voice polished and professional. The board of directors has unanimously appointed Matthew Kane, his eldest son, as interim CEO. Analysts say this marks a new chapter for the company. A picture flashed on the screen, him, leaving the courthouse, jaw clenched, looking furious. The caption read, Fall of a Giant. Thomas Kane removed from power. Thomas switched off the TV. Outside, in the driveway, he could hear the distant sound of car doors slamming, neighbors, no doubt whispering about him. The Kane estate had been the pride of the town for decades, a symbol of success. Now it was a spectacle. By noon, Matthew arrived. He didn't knock, he just walked in like he owned the place now. Dad, he said briskly, we need to talk about the house. Thomas didn't look up from his chair. What about it? You can't keep this place by yourself. It's too big, too expensive. The board thinks. Thomas cut him off with a sharp laugh. The board? Since when does the board decide where I live? Matthew's expression hardened. Since you're no longer legally capable of managing your finances. Look, we've arranged for the property to be sold. You'll be moved into a smaller place, closer to medical care. Thomas stood, slow and deliberate, his towering frame casting a shadow over his son. You think you can take my home too? It's just a house, Dad. No. Thomas's voice dropped to a growl. This is where I raised you. This is where your mother took her last breath. And you think you can just sell it? Matthew didn't flinch. This isn't about emotions. This is about what's best for everyone. Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then turned away. Get out of my house, Matthew. Matthew hesitated, then finally left, slamming the door behind him. Within a month, the house was gone. Thomas watched from the driveway as movers carried out furniture he had owned for 30 years. The family portraits, the grandfather clock, even the leather chair where he used to read bedtime stories to the boys, gone. He was relocated to a modern apartment on the edge of town. To simplify his life. His bank accounts were restricted. The board assigned him a monthly allowance as if he were a child. The humiliation was suffocating. Worse, Daniel stopped returning his calls. When Thomas finally drove to his house unannounced, Daniel's wife met him at the door. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she said awkwardly, blocking the entrance. "Daniel's not here. And I think it's better if you don't visit for a while." "Better for who?" Thomas asked, his voice like ice. She didn't answer. The door closed. That night, Thomas sat alone in his small apartment. The silence was unbearable. He stared at an old photo, the four of them together at a company anniversary celebration. Matthew with his arm around him, Daniel laughing. Back then, they were proud of him. He poured himself another drink, but his hand trembled. Maybe they were right, he thought bitterly. Maybe I am just an old man who doesn't know when to step aside. He sat in the dark for hours. But then, somewhere deep inside, a different thought emerged. No! This wasn't about him being old. This was about greed. About betrayal. They had stripped him of everything, his company, his home, his dignity. And now they wanted him quiet. Forgotten. Thomas stood, walked to the mirror, and looked at himself. His eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with age, but there was still steel in his gaze. He whispered to his reflection, "You are Thomas Kane. You built an empire from nothing. And if they think they can take it from you, they have no idea what war looks like." 2 weeks later, Thomas was gone. His apartment was empty. The allowance checks went uncashed. His car sat in the lot, keys left inside. When Matthew called the police, they found no sign of foul play. "He probably went off somewhere to sulk," Matthew said dismissively to Daniel. "Good. Maybe he'll stay there." Daniel wasn't so sure. "He's not the type to just disappear," he said quietly. But Thomas Kane had disappeared, and that was exactly what he wanted. Somewhere, miles away from the town, Thomas Kane sat in a small cabin deep in the woods, a fire burning in the hearth. On the table in front of him lay a notebook filled with names, dates, and plans. And for the first time since the court ruling, Thomas smiled. "Let's see how you like losing everything, boys," he muttered, flipping the page and beginning to draw the first lines of his revenge. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke. It had been 6 months since Thomas Kane vanished from the public eye. 6 months since the world last saw the fallen CO. But the man sitting at the wooden table now was not the same man who had left. His hair was shorter, his frame leaner, his shoulders straight. Every morning he woke before dawn, chopped wood, cooked his own meals, and trained like a soldier preparing for war. And in the evenings, he planned. Through discreet calls and quiet meetings, Thomas reached out to people he once trusted, loyal employees forced out by his sons, old business partners, even competitors who respected him. He met them in diners, in warehouses, in parking lots late at night. "Matthew and Daniel think they've won," Thomas told them. "But they're tearing the company apart. I intend to take back what's mine. Will you stand with me?" One by one, they agreed. Through a network of proxies, Thomas began buying up shares of Kane Industries, slowly, quietly, until he controlled a sizable block again. And while he built his financial leverage, he gathered information. He learned that Matthew had been embezzling company funds to cover personal debts. He learned that Daniel had been taking bribes to approve bad contracts. Both of them were vulnerable, and Thomas was about to use every weakness against them. The first scandal hit on a rainy Tuesday morning. An anonymous whistleblower leaked documents to the press, showing Kane Industries had lost millions in a failed overseas deal, a deal Daniel had personally approved. Within days, the stock price dipped. Investors began to murmur. Then came the second leak, photos of Matthew at a private casino, gambling with company money. Matthew and Daniel held an emergency press conference, blaming false reports, and corporate sabotage. Thomas watched the broadcast from his cabin and smiled. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. 2 months later, the annual shareholder meeting was packed. Reporters swarmed the entrance, eager to see how the embattled brothers would defend themselves. And then, the doors opened, and Thomas Kane walked in. The room went silent. He was wearing a dark suit, perfectly tailored, his posture straight, his presence commanding. Matthew froze. Daniel went pale. "Dad," Matthew said through gritted teeth, "what are you doing here?" Thomas walked to the podium, handed a document to the board chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his deep voice filling the room, "I am the majority shareholder of Kane Industries. As of this morning, I hold controlling interest in the company I built. And I am here to demand the immediate resignation of both acting executives, Matthew Kane and Daniel Kane, on grounds of corruption, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty." Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. Matthew shot to his feet. "You can't do this." "Oh, I can," Thomas replied calmly. "And I just did." He projected documents onto the screen, proof of the embezzlement, the bribes, the lies. The board voted within minutes. The brothers were removed. The press swarmed them as security escorted them out. Later that night, Thomas found them sitting in the empty parking lot, their expensive suits soaked from the rain. "Why?" Daniel asked bitterly. "Why would you humiliate us like this?" Thomas stared at them, his voice cold but steady. "You humiliated yourselves the day you dragged me into that courtroom," he said. "You could have asked me to step aside. I would have listened. But you wanted power. You wanted me gone. So you buried me alive." Matthew clenched his fists. "We were trying to protect the company." "No," Thomas said sharply. "You were trying to protect yourselves. And now you've lost everything." He turned to leave, then paused. "I didn't do this to destroy you," he said quietly. "I did this to teach you. Loyalty is worth more than power. Trust is worth more than money. If you can't understand that, you don't deserve the Kane name." And with that, Thomas walked away, leaving his son sitting in the rain, broken. Months later, Kane Industries was thriving again under new leadership handpicked by Thomas. Thomas himself did not return as CEO. He didn't need to. He had proven his point. Some nights, he would sit by the fire and wonder if his sons had learned their lesson. But then, he would remember their faces that night in the parking lot, and he knew they would never forget what he had done. And neither would H.